Good evening, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and it is a joy to welcome you to the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Spring Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening as we continue to explore the 20th century movers and shakers in Community of Christ history. Tonight, we will hear from Tony Chvala-Smith in a lecture called Storm Clouds on the Horizon, the Competing Theological Visions of Elbert A. Smith and Roy Cheville. Our spring lecture series is not only a great way to spend a Thursday night learning church history, it's also a benefit for the Community of Christ historic sites. The sites are temporarily closed for the rest of the year due to COVID-19, but the preservation and maintenance of the historic sites continues on. Your donations are critical at this time, as the loss of revenue from site preservation fees and museum store sales over the past year is unprecedented. As we continue to work towards the goal of becoming self-sustaining, your donations from tonight's lecture will help support and preserve Community of Christ historic sites for future generations. For those wanting to make an online donation, you will find the donations link in the chat box. You're also welcome to send a donation through the mail to the address also found in the chat box. Thank you so much for your generous support as we strive to preserve Community of Christ heritage. Our guest speaker this evening is our dear friend, Tony Chvala-Smith. Tony lives in Independence, Missouri. He is Associate Professor and Paul E. Morden Seminary Chair of Religion at Community of Christ Seminary and Graceland University. Tony also serves at the church's international headquarters as a scripture and theology consultant and chairs the church's theology formation team. In addition, he represents Community of Christ on the Faith and Order convening table of the National Council of Churches. Tony and his partner Charmaine Chvala-Smith regularly work together in their many varied roles for the seminary, Graceland, and the church. I'll also add that Tony and Charmaine are incredible chefs. If you are ever invited over to their home for a meal, you be sure to take them up on their delicious offer. You won't regret it. Welcome, Tony, and thank you again for agreeing to share with us tonight. I'll now hand the microphone over to you, as we are all looking forward to hearing about Roy A. Cheville and Elbert A. Smith.
Thank you, Barb. And it's just a very lovely pleasure to be with you tonight. It's nice. I hope it's not a bad thing for a theologian to be doing history with you tonight. Theologians nowadays are trained to do history as well as theology. So I feel very much at home in a historical community. So we're going to go to some interesting places tonight. And I hope the storm cloud picture doesn't frighten you too much. If I were in the little boat out on the lake, I would say I would be getting off, though. That would be my feeling about it. So storm clouds on the horizon. What can it mean when two accomplished, articulate, mutually appreciative representatives of a community hold incompatible frameworks for understanding that community's identity? I want to raise that question in this lecture and explore it with you. Every human community, from the most intimate personal relationships to the most complex institutions, has embedded within it paradoxes, contradictions, and conflicted spaces. These are both latent and active. In the period from 1920 to 1960, the reorganized church was no exception. Its defenders and expositors worked from what seemed to them the invincible conviction that they alone rightly represented genuine Christianity and the one true church. But as I hope to show in this lecture, the seeds of a far-ranging deconstruction and reformation of reorganization identity already lay in the furrows of that mid-20th century period. I want to demonstrate that by looking briefly at two towering figures from that period, Elbert A. Smith and Roy A. Cheville. My interest and passion is understanding Community of Christ's developing theological identity. But historical theologians like me don't believe you can do that apart from wrestling with the past. I constantly repeat for our history of Christian thought students some of these words from the great historian Jaroslav Pelikan. Pelikan says this, quote, "A leap of progress is not a standing broad jump, which begins at the line of where we are now. It is a running broad jump through where we have been to where we go next. The growth of insight in science and the arts and philosophy and theology has not come through progressively sloughing off more and more of tradition, as though insight would be purest and deepest when it has finally freed itself from the dead past. But we do acquire insight when we learn to interact creatively with tradition." Let me begin this lecture by stating that the supreme directional control controversy of the 1920s had already disclosed deep-seated disagreements within the reorganization about how the church should function. The theologian will say deep-seated disagreements about ecclesiology. Should the church seek to operate efficiently from the top, led by the prophet president as a CEO? Or should the church function as a sort of loose-knit federal republic with quasi-independent cantons headed by an apostle as the jurisdictional hierarch? Believing that one had the true restored priesthood apparently did not preclude discord about how to manage church life with it. Lest one suppose that fissures over theology and polity were a mere blip on the 20th century screen, we only have to think back to the founding decades of the new organization and the reorganization, that period from 1850 to the 1880s. The church was haunted then by the nagging question of what to do with the theological debris from Nauvoo. Joseph Smith III managed this source of conflict by means of his often commented on strategy of outliving those still loyal to some of Joseph Smith Jr.'s theological curios from Nauvoo. It would take another century for the church to confront the actuality of the theological train wreck that was Nauvoo. So I hope it comes as no surprise that in the reorganized church in mid-20th century, new theological fault lines were emerging. They were largely invisible to many participants in that part of the story. But history, as what I like to call disciplined hindsight, allows us at our current distance to see these fault lines more clearly, especially in the work of two much loved church leaders from that period, Elbert A. Smith and Roy A. Cheville. So now I'm going to be turning my attention to these two figures. Cheville and Elbert A. deserve to be studied together. This is partly for historical reasons. Large segments of their ministries overlapped. Further, Elbert A. was the church's presiding patriarch from 1938 to 1958, and Cheville followed him in that role, serving until 1974. But my reason for treating these two figures together is that one can see very clearly in their writings starkly divergent, even incompatible understandings of the reorganization. Or to put it another way, Elbert A.'s and Cheville's theological frameworks portended a coming storm, a storm that would shake the church down to its foundations in the 1960s and 70s. Now, a word about what I'm going to do next. I am going to offer a critical theological analysis of these two men's ideas, these two men who were deeply venerated by church members in their day. Some of you here may have had experience with Roy Cheville. I don't know if anybody here might have had experience with Elbert, but very likely some had experience with Cheville. Smith and Cheville deserve respect, admiration, and gratitude for their contribution to the journey that is Community of Christ. At the same time, their contributions were time-bound, as all ours are. We creatures being finite and possessing expiration dates. What they achieved was offered within the boundaries of a particular cultural horizon. That's just the way things are. And what they offered, as we look back with hindsight, does remain open to questioning. We can ask questions about it. We can even critique. Again, as all our contributions will someday be questioned and critiqued if they aren't already. As I mentioned, one of my interests and passions is understanding how Community of Christ theology has emerged, has developed, and is developing. To do that, I must understand trends, decisions, interpretative stances, beliefs, texts, ideas on their own terms in relation to their originating contexts. That's what historical theologians do. And secondly, I need to understand them from the standpoint of their later effects on decisions and church life in later periods. So what I'm trying to say is I'm going to approach Elbert A. and Cheville like I would in any class, like I would approach Martin Luther or Augustine of Hippo or Julian of Norwich, with what I call charitable openness and critical scrutiny. Those are the qualities you need in a healthy relationship. And I want to have a healthy relationship with our past. And that's going to require charitable openness and critical scrutiny. And all the while, as these two amazing pictures before you indicate, all the while we need to remember that a person is more than the sum of their writings or actions. These two men were persons who deeply, deeply impacted the lives of others. I begin with Brother Elbert, as he was affectionately called. Elbert A., who's on the far left of your screen in front of you, Elbert A. was a figure dear to many in the church, a blood heir of the founding dynasty. He was son of David Hiram. David Hiram, as you may know, had a kind of tragic life. David Hiram died when Elbert was a few years old. Elbert was a gentle and kindly minister with deep pastoral instincts and wisdom. He had warned Fred M. not to push supreme directional control, yet he remained a faithful supporter of both church and leadership in the aftermath of the conflict. If I may borrow language Paul Edwards aptly applies to Joseph Smith III, Elbert A. was one of the last of the old world leaders of the church, by which we mean kind of like 19th century frame of reference. Even in the mid-20th century, Elbert A. seemed to embody the spiritual values, experiences, ethos, and convictions of the Joseph III era. Cheville praised Brother Elbert effusively as a model of that charity which is the pure love of Christ. And he did this in his book, They Made a Difference, published in 1970. So I do want to make clear right up front, Cheville and Elbert A. thought very highly of each other, as far as I can tell. Though Elbert A.'s formal education was minimal, he wrote many books and pamphlets, was editor of the Herald, and served ably as counselor to Fred M. Smith. But what interests me for this lecture is Elbert A. Smith's book, Restoration, A Study in Prophecy. It is the closest thing we have to a script for the old 1912 Weston preaching chart. That is, you can say it's the Weston chart is the first draft of what will become the Go Ye and Teach slides that were used for a long time in the church to help people become members of the church. Those of you who've had Community of Christ theology classes from Charmaine and me, you know we love these charts and we bring them with us and always hang them. This one is not the one we typically hang, but it's pretty old. This one is probably close to an original. It's probably close to 1912. So this book, Restoration, A Study in Prophecy, was widely popular among church members, though it seems curiously out of step. It was published in 1945. It seems curiously out of step when read against contemporary works by Cheville and by F. Henry Edwards and Arthur Oatman, and even out of step with some of Fred M.'s forays into social gospel theology. While at hindsight distance, Restoration, A Study in Prophecy seems out of step with writings of some other authors, it nevertheless authentically represented the convictions of many members of the Reorganization, as these convictions were taught and defended throughout North America in the 1940s and 50s. Much to my surprise, as late as the 1990s, Charmaine and I ventured into a small congregation in a mission center in a galaxy far from where I'm sitting. And lo and behold, we found the adult Sunday school class still using Restoration, A Study in Prophecy as their Sunday school material. Not a happy moment for me, but I'm just raising it to say how long the half-life was on this book. Brother Elbert restated in this book in simple, really lovely, clear prose, traditions that had formed the theological discourse of the church for nearly a century. The prophets saw our day, Brother Elbert asserted, arguing that the restoration was predicted in biblical prophecy. He insisted, as church apologists had for decades, that since the reorganization was the restoration of the true church, quote, we are neither Catholics nor Protestants, end quote. Smith's ideas there reflected both the widespread anti-Catholicism of much American religious culture at that time, as well as the reorganization's anti-Protestantism in the tradition of the famous RLDS preacher R.C. Evans, who later left the church to form his own community in Toronto, Ontario. I forget what it was called. It might as well have been called the Church of R.C. Evans, because that's kind of was the focus of it. Not Catholics, not Protestants, but the real church. Relying on the old dispensationalist speculations of Daniel McGregor, Brother Elbert relates the belief that the original church went into apostasy in the year 570 AD and was restored in 1830 in fulfillment of the 1260 days of Revelation chapter 12, verse 6. One notes in this book Smith's harsh and kind of simplistic criticism of classical Christian creeds, a criticism based on the 1842 account of Joseph's first vision. The creeds were an abomination, says Elbert A, because, quote, they represented an attempt to put religion into molds to become crystallized, end quote. This is ironic in the extreme when one considers that the theological system of old reorganization theology was monumentally inflexible. Indeed, was kind of the epitome of crystallized beliefs and theology. From today's vantage point, Restoration, A Study in Prophecy shows little grasp of the historical development of Christianity, no understanding of the origins and content of the classic Christian creeds, and no awareness of mid-20th century biblical scholarship. Now, one expects this. Smith was not theologically trained like nearly everyone around him in his time, but formed by the church's traditions. This, of course, put him in step with many members. Well, a few people in that generation of church leaders had some theological knowledge of a different sort. To the majority of church members, that kind of knowledge was unavailable and would have been undesirable even if it were accessible. Restoration, a Study in Prophecy, was an authoritative text in many ways, some of them unhelpful. Elbert A's writing of this book, in effect, placed the Smith imprimatur on a theology that would, by the late 1960s, become indefensible and burdensome. Hindsight, again, the historian's friend, hindsight suggests that this book is a cautionary tale about how a text that confirmed members' beliefs in one setting contributed in another setting to the theological equivalent of an arterial blockage. Roy Cheville, quite to the contrary, offered the church a remarkably modern restatement of restoration beliefs in an equally convincing package. He is a fascinating individual, the subject of two biographies. Alas, both of them are written by Cheville partisans, which doesn't mean they're bad. It just means that the authors really like Cheville. Sometimes not good for a biographer. These are Henry Inouye's Roy A. Cheville, Explorer of Spiritual Frontiers, and Malcolm Ritchie's 2-volume set, just simply called Roy Cheville. One could reasonably teach a whole course on Cheville. So creative and prolific a theological author was he. Cheville was, as far as I know, the first formally trained theologian in reorganization history. He did master's and doctoral work in religion at the famed University of Chicago, ultimately finishing a PhD by 1942. Those generations of church members who took classes from him at Cheville or experienced his ministry in church settings fondly called him Doc. He was a prodigious author. He wrote many books and dozens of Herald articles. His books, such as The Bible in Everyday Living, The Book of Mormon speaks for itself, When Teenagers Talk Theology, and Spirituality in the Space Age, were the staple of adult Sunday school classes for decades. Cheville was a teenage convert to the church, possessed of an agile mind and a gregarious, even overpowering personality. What is of cardinal importance for us to remember is that he sought and received formal theological training outside the church in an era when that was tantamount to heresy. But Cheville did this to equip himself to teach at Graceland College, or in Graceland College's religious studies program, where he served ably and influentially for decades. This picture of him leading hymns at conference is rather telling. I have heard people who knew him say he would lead cheers at football games at Graceland. So this man, as far as I know, seems to have come from the mothership of extroverts, is what it sounds like to me. In his era, the University of Chicago was the preeminent American institution for the scholarly study of religion, and it was the flagship graduate school of liberal Protestant thought. Its professors were thoroughly committed to modern critical understandings of religion, theology, and the Bible. Among the faculty were some of the best minds of the day. The naturalistic philosopher of religion, Henry Nelson Wyman. You can see this description of one of his basic ideas, that the universe is self-contained and best understood or explicated in natural, that is, biological, psychological, chemical categories without reference to transcendent categories. Wyman held that we used the term God for whatever in human experience transforms us, as we could not transform ourselves. So there was Wyman, and there was John Dewey, whose pragmatism has deeply influenced American education. And then there was the highly regarded theologian Shaler Matthews. So Shaler Matthews is kind of the dean of liberal Protestant theology in the United States. He was one of the foremost voices of that school of thought. Theologian John Macquarrie notes that key themes in Matthews' thought were that God is an immanent power in the universe, who brings forth personality, that human beings are fellow workers. That's more like Wyman's word, fellow workers, co-workers, we would say, with God in the process of establishing the kingdom of God. And that our kinship to God makes for the possibility of union and moral change in our ongoing development. So mark these terms here: development, process, personality. These are going to be very important ideas in Cheville's thought, and especially the idea that God is immanent, right at work within the world and not distant and far away. Cheville's theology I refer to as sui generis. It's Latin. It means it's its own thing, its own genus. He can be accurately identified as a reorganization modernist. He combined empiricist, functionalist, pragmatist philosophy as of Dewey. And let me stop for a second. Empiricism means we work with the data of the five senses. Functionalism means that we always want to ask, how does a certain thing function in the life of a people before we ever ask questions about whether it's true? And pragmatism, which is similar, that which aids the development of human beings, that is true, not some ideal truth out there somewhere that may not necessarily impact or help human beings develop. So those things influence Cheville's thought. The liberal Protestantism of Matthews and Walter Rauschenbusch, progressive American optimism, which oozes from Cheville, wherever you see pictures of him and whatever you read about him. And then a fairly traditional collection of reorganization distinctives, but very carefully repackaged in Cheville's distinctive language and ideas. This is kind of a portrait of Cheville's theology. Now, I have to say that Cheville apparently did not like people saying, well, you seem to be influenced by so-and-so and so-and-so. He liked to claim, I've not been influenced by any of these people. I've thought it up myself. So the historical theologian in me will say, no, that's not possible, and it's not true. You may think you thought it first, but all these ideas were in the air that Cheville was breathing growing up. So Cheville offered new twists on restoration themes. He was vigorously and sometimes unkindly critical of the literalism and naive millennialism of many church members. He introduced generations of students at Graceland to their first exposure to biblical scholarship and biblical criticism and to contemporary theology, always with his own spin on it. And all this while staying deeply engaged in the life of the church. He traveled frequently to preach and teach. Former Graceland President Gerald Knudsen once told Charmaine and me that Cheville loved to come into a district stake for a full week of ministry, and that he would energetically preach, teach, visit, and generally whip things up. You won't be surprised to learn that one of Cheville's favorite words was enthusiasm. Cheville's theological method, his approach, was to take a revered theme of the reorganization, subject it to a kind of pragmatist criticism, and how does this work? Does it not work? What can make it work better? And then reconfigure it with a new focus on human action and development. For Cheville, if a belief did not result in vital positive human action, it could not be usefully retained. Curiously, when a new generation of reorganization young adults, including some of his own students, went on for theological training and then returned with criticisms of Cheville's own kind of unyielding 1920s conceptuality, Doc was less than appreciative. A good example of Cheville's theological approach appears in his little book, Expectations for Endowed Living, published by Herald in 1970. I bought a copy of it at my very first reunion experience in Michigan as a young adult convert to the church, which was in the summer of 1976. I bought it at one of those stands at reunions that would sell Herald House books. So in reorganization lore, I'm going to talk about the book for a second. In reorganization lore, there had emerged a tradition that taught of a coming experience of supernatural spiritual outpouring, the endowment. In mid-20th century church life, this endowment belief was popularly imagined as a kind of day of Pentecost on steroids. It would vindicate to the world that the RLDS were who they said they were, and would give faithful church members quasi-divine superpowers. No more, for example, would medicine need to be studied because the endowment would turn members into healers. Cheville was skeptical. He found the hopes cultivated around this tradition somewhat absurd, indeed nearly superstitious, and completely disempowering of human growth, and based on a faulty hope for some future miraculous divine bailout. He wrote Expectation for Endowed Living as a corrective. Endowment was about becoming prepared through action and learning for witness, and not about receiving a spiritual thrill. Here's a quote from the book that I think is quite telling. The endowment is not going to come, and I've heard recordings of his voice. I hope I don't break into him. I can almost hear him saying this. The endowment is not going to come to those who are waiting in idleness and complaint and self-concern. It is not going to come so that Latter-day Saints can make headlines and attract others into affiliation. It is not going to come to those who limit Jesus Christ in color and social standing or in other ways. The endowment in our day is going to come to those who truly want to live with the universal Christ, to love with him, to mission with him. And this endowment can come in whatever manifestation will equip us to see and to do with this ever-living, all-loving Christ. End of quote. Now, I have to point out from this quote, Cheville made up words and liked to use words in what, to my ear, sounds strange ways. But he liked to turn nouns into verbs. And so that phrase there, the endowment's going to come to those who want to mission with Christ. Very, very characteristic of his approach. He liked to turn language kind of on its head and use it to wake people up. So in this book, for Cheville, the misty-eyed hopes for a future wondrous event that would miraculously empower people by overriding natural processes of human development were little more than mythology and spiritual laziness writ large to him. Cheville thought this wish dreaming had no power to shape persons into vital agents of good in the world. There's his pragmatism and personalism coming out there. For Cheville, this old RLDS tradition of the endowment was based on a view of God as above and beyond, rather than as here and now. A view of God as working magically from the outside, instead of actively being present as co-worker, drawing us forward into mission. So in the tradition of Protestant liberalism, Cheville reinterpreted this doctrine, removing from it what he saw as immature supernaturalism and refocusing it ethically. And this is classic Protestant liberal theology. He's a very good representative of it, and a unique representative of it from a tradition, our tradition, that's not well known in the history of Christian thought. Now, what Cheville failed to do, or would not do, was question whether this theological idea, based on the sacred memory of Kirtland and the church's kind of apocalyptic hopes for the future, was itself still theologically credible. He doesn't ask that question. He was unable to see that his reconstructed version of the Endowment had essentially stripped the tradition of its meaning, and in so doing, revealed the idea itself to be irrelevant. One might see his theological reinterpretation of the old Endowment tradition as a kind of card trick by which Cheville, cautious about supernaturalist ideas, kept the word endowment, but turned it into a synonym for self-improvement and human betterment. But then, did the word emptied of its previous meaning even need to be retained as theologically viable? If I could sit across the table from Cheville, that's the kind of question I would ask him about a number of things. You've taken the idea, you've reinterpreted it as X, it no longer is now what it was. Tell me about that. Why would you then keep the idea? What's the purpose of that? Interestingly, Cheville, for his questioning mind, never really questioned the foundations of the church's beliefs, and especially the church's then current views of its own history. Rather, in what I see as a surface way, Cheville kept intact the form and language of traditional ideas and beliefs. He gave them a kind of modernist facelift, but then actually refused to deal with serious theological and historical issues that underlay these issues that were roiling around in church life. You know, for example, he writes a book called Joseph and Emma, Companions, about Joseph and Emma as a married couple. I think we would write that book very differently today. Cheville essentially turns them into a symbol of companionship. Never mind all the issues that, that historians were raising to the surface about their troubled relationship and their struggles connected to such things as polygamy. He just doesn't go to places like that. So it's really important also to know that Cheville was openly critical of the new theological paradigms the church was taking on in the 1960s. He was not invited by church leaders to be part of the theological task force in that decade. And that was the theological task force that produced the book Exploring the Faith in 1970, which was then reissued in 1987. That text was formed by a theological paradigm very different from Cheville's own. And here I want to share anecdotally from a conversation with a former member of the presidency by the name of Dwayne Couey. Dwayne was very dear to Charmaine and me, and we counted him as mentor and dear friend. And I once asked Couey, after Malcolm Ritchie had presented Charmaine and me with the 2 volumes of his books on Cheville, and Ritchie had harangued me for a long time about how Cheville was the last best hope for the church, and the church didn't pay any attention to him, and he wasn't included in this and wasn't included in that. So I asked Dwayne, I've heard this. Why wasn't Cheville included in the theology task force at that time? And Dwayne, who was as gentle and kind as Elbert A, Dwayne said to me, well, Cheville was kept off that task force because church leadership knew if he were on it, he would try to dominate the discourse, dominate everything, bend everything to his own kind of now passé 1920s theological framework. They were afraid he would try to dominate and control and steer the church in a backwards direction, not forward. Some of Cheville's own Graceland students believed he didn't go far enough in his own willingness to offer criticism of our tradition. He might critique simplistic literalism and naive or immature spirituality, but he would not critically ask whether some of the church's beliefs were substantively Christian or based on misconceived ideas. Though open to some new knowledge, he was not open to a complete rethinking of the RLDS story and belief system. Indeed, there was a point where Herald House would no longer publish his manuscripts because they believed he was simply recycling his characteristic old ideas, grounded in the philosophical language of the 1920s and 30s. In a sense, he was never able to break out of the theological modes of thinking that formed him in that earlier 20th century era and explore new ones. His optimistic 1920s era pull yourself up rhetoric seems strangely out of place in a post-Holocaust, Cold War, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, nuclear age. It just didn't really fit well. Now, he's true to form in thoroughly modern fashion when he died on April 6th. Get this, on April 6th, 1986, during World Conference. I mean, how did he plan that out? I do not know. The presidency announced to the World Conference that Dr. Cheville's body would be donated to medical science. In Cheville's own words, death would be for him graduating to the University of Eternity. It's a great concept. I have lots of students who would say, gosh, I hope there's not a university there. I'm really tired of being graded. So some concluding thoughts. How different were these two presiding patriarchs? Elbert A looked back to the missionary message of the preaching chart and then set it in literary stone in that book. Cheville looked optimistically ahead, reinterpreting reorganization beliefs and updating them in a pragmatic direction. Brother Elbert harked back to a pre-modern way of being RLDS. Brother Cheville accommodated many reorganization ideas to mid-century modernity, trying to make them fit better into a developmental evolutionary framework. Elbert A thought in biblical proof texts and old reorganite traditions. Cheville rejected literalism and mere appeals to tradition if all these did was disempower human action. Brother Elbert thought the 1912 preaching chart was the gospel. Cheville freely re-expressed doctrines and traditions that he thought useful. He did that for the useful ones, we'll say. Brother Elbert believed in the one-two church and its distinctives. Its distinctives as a list of beliefs and ideas. Brother Cheville believed that, and I'm going to quote him now from a 1968 article, quote, in a vital functioning religion, conceptions are ever expanding and phrasing has to keep up, end quote. That's a quintessential Cheville comment there. Both men loved the church and in turn were beloved by its members. But in the divergence of their theological paradigms, one can see already in the 1940s a great storm front forming on the horizon. One paradigm looks backward to a thought world of a pre-modern rural Midwestern sect. The other hesitantly imagines a global future it is not yet equipped to embrace. To my starting question, what does it mean when two accomplished, articulate, mutually appreciative representatives of a community hold incompatible frameworks for understanding that community's identity? Cheville and Elbert were shaped by different symbols and interpretive frameworks, which I've not unfairly called incompatible. It's really hard to make these frameworks fit. And whatever happened in the church after them, the cool thing is that it did not happen between them. Why? It is instructive to me that both men were devoted followers of Jesus and utterly committed, not to the theory, but to the practice of being the church. They didn't bail on church when church got hard. They were committed to life in community. And they were committed to being followers of Jesus, even if they understood Jesus in different ways. There is an ancient theological maxim in Christian tradition it says this in Latin: lex orandi, lex credendi. The law is the law of believing. Here's what it means. If you want to understand what someone really believes, listen to them pray. I think we can properly extend that maxim to mean something like this. If you want to understand what someone really believes, listen to what they sing. Elbert A. and Cheville set their faith to music, and we still sing their hymns. We heard two of them as we started this evening. Elbert A.'s beautifully sweet Christmas hymn, Silvery Star, is magnificent. And Cheville's powerful Send Forth Your Light, O Zion. These remain part of the 21st century church's repertoire of hymns. Remarkably, yet perhaps not really unexpectedly, in these two hymns, the profound differences of framework and paradigm and theology and ideology of these two past thinkers disappear. Those differences disappear. They are transcended by the divine invitation to journey towards the one that Scripture calls the mediator. To quote Brother Elbert, in the still night unto Christ, speaking of the Magi there. And to quote Brother Cheville, to make on earth incarnate Christ's sacrificial love. Do you begin to see how the words of these two hymns meld in the theology of the church, and the differences which are real and incompatible between these two figures somehow are taken up and transcended in a whole new way in those words, which point to the centrality of Christ in the life of the church. This, I think, is a lesson from the past that's truly worth making that running broad jump through.
Thank you so much, Tony, for sharing your thoughts on Roy Cheville and Elbert A. Smith. So thank you to Megan and Barb for helping to co-host this evening and for managing everything that's been going on behind the scenes. And lastly, we always share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for your love of a good story and for generously supporting the Community of Christ Historic Sites with your donations. Thank you so much for your support. Now, I encourage you to tune in next week as we hear from Sherry Mesley-Moraine in a lecture called Carl Mesley, Pastor in a Time of Turmoil. It's sure to be a good one, and Sherry's really excited to share with us. We're going to close this evening, even though it's late. I'm going to share my screen again. And for those of you who are interested in hearing again, we're going to share the two songs that we started with. We'll hear Elbert A. Smith's song, Silvery Star, Precious Star first. Then we'll hear Roy Cheville's song, Send Forth Thy Light, O Zion.
And Peter, if I may,
Yes.
Kudos to Charmaine, my partner, who was the one who suggested earlier today. You guys can do any music in that? It would be really good to have some Cheville or Elbert A. hymns in that. So that's where that started, and I wanted to thank you guys for making space for that.
We were happy to do that. It added a lot to our evening. So thank you, everyone. Stay for a moment. I'll share my screen again if you'd like to. And other than that, keep reading your church history. Take care and have a good night.